Hey everybody, welcome back to Rough Cut
Yeah.
Faith. Thanks for being here today with us whenever you watch.
Yeah.
Scott,
Hi.
glad you're here.
I'll let you know if I am later.
Well, I am. Yeah.
I'm glad to be here. It's
Yeah.
good to sit down again.
Oh.
You know.
Today we are discussing something that
Yeah.
I guess it could be heavier.
Maybe. I don't know. We try to carry so many light things in these
Yeah, we
conversations.
typically try to get real light in our conversations
Yeah.
and real. But today we're talking about loneliness today. And Scott threatened to walk away when we started.
Good morning.
Just walk off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you've chosen to stay.
Yeah, well, I haven't quietly determined whether I am or not.
Yeah, some of us like to be alone.
Yeah.
Some people need to be with others.
Yeah.
But
some of us used to like to be around people. And
and now desire want to be alone.
It's just, I think there's a difference between valuing alone time
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
like being alone.
So in your life, when have there been times where you've wanted to be around people or felt alone? And I'm asking this because there is this epidemic of loneliness
Sure.
that's going throughout our culture. We've even in the past year, I think you were reading
Yeah.
an article. I read an article similar that was talking about the Surgeon General of the United States was talking about the health, the damage that is coming to our health collectively from loneliness, and how it actually is more of an epidemic that's damaging our society.
Yeah, it was interesting because they basically equated loneliness with like smoking 15 cigarettes a day for the potential for a premature death.
Yeah.
Right. And then there was like an increase in heart disease, increase in dementia later as an adult, increase for cancer. Like it was a very interesting.
So I think it's really important to recognize that it's not just an emotional state.
Yeah, no, it does physically affect us.
There are physical repercussions
Yeah.
for being alone.
Yeah.
For an extended period of
and
time.
I think
for loneliness,
Yeah,
let's say that,
yeah.
not just being alone.
And I think there's a real important distinction in that you can be lonely and be in a crowd of people.
Yeah.
Like, because there is a distinction in that a lot of times people think, oh, you're really friendly. Oh, you're here, but that person may be terribly lonely. Even though they're socially engaging and interacting with people in a way that helps people be like, oh no, I would have never imagined that they could have been depressed or and so I think that's probably one of those aspects of it that's really important to at least acknowledge that just because someone is like outgoing, personable, all of that stuff, and seems to have a lot of connections with friends and people that they care about or that care about them, that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily dealing with loneliness.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe maybe we should look at it, and this is probably the qualifier where this is not like a medical definition of loneliness, but how would you define loneliness? Because I would say there have been times in my life where I have felt incredibly lonely or incredibly alone, and that's usually those seasons have been often when, even though I was connected and doing a lot of things and connected to a lot of people, I didn't feel known.
Yeah.
And felt like there was a facade that had to be there, and maybe not a facade, but I didn't feel like I could be myself. Completely, or that anyone understood what I was going through. Yeah. Right. And so maybe we should create that experience of how would we in this conversation how would we categorize loneliness?
Well, I think that's a good, like, your experience is a really good metric to use in one of the ways that loneliness is categorized.
I feel like I'm a case study every time we have this conversation. No, it's just,
you could ask me questions.
that would mean I would have to not talk.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So
that's our dynamic.
Yeah,
Michael.
Yeah. I ask the questions and you talk. That's how it works.
It's the opposite of when we're alone, right?
Yeah.
So
I think that the being known part is really big.
Yeah.
I think of one time for me, a moment that stands out in particular when I felt very alone.
Yeah.
There have been other times throughout my life, but when I was in college, it was my senior year, and the dorm that I stayed in college, I didn't hang out there a whole lot.
Yeah.
Most of my friends were outside of that dorm.
Yeah.
But I lived there, and it was kind of weird to be like,
Yeah.
I'm living with 300 other people.
Yeah.
And in this, but in that context, I didn't really know many. And we had a big event. They had this common area in the dorm, and they weren't co-ed dorms, but there was women were on one side, the men were on the other side
Yeah.
of the
And then there
dorms,
was
and
a
then the
common
common
middle,
area.
yeah.
So there was this big party. It was a midnight, like at midnight.
Yeah.
There's food everywhere. I mean, it was just pizza and wings and tons of stuff, and everybody was down in this space.
Yeah.
And that was the time. That was one time I look back at in my life and think I felt most alone there in that crowd.
Yeah.
With all of the people, even people that I knew because
Yeah.
I lived there.
Yeah.
But I walked in and it was overwhelming, first of all,
Yeah.
as an introvert.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
As an introvert, I walked into a room with like 300, 400
yeah.
people.
So I went to
and
the library.
I ate 2 wings and went back to my room.
Yeah.
And I cried because I was like, I've been here. That was my junior year. I graduated that year. So I
Yeah.
said senior year, but I had only been there for 3 years.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm going to graduate this year and I don't know anyone
Yeah.
and nobody there knows me.
Yeah.
And I just was this stranger in a crowd, and
Yeah.
it was extremely lonely and it was so painful.
Yeah.
But it was like that psychological loneliness.
Yeah.
And I think there's a difference
Yeah.
in that when you can be in a crowd and yet feel lonely. You can be in even amongst acquaintances
Sure.
and feel lonely. And I do think it goes back to that being known part that
Yeah.
you referenced.
Yeah.
Now, in when the Surgeon General talked about loneliness
Yeah.
and the epidemic of loneliness, he defined it as when the needs, the social connected needs that you have are greater than what are actually provided.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Sure.
So you need more social connections than what are actually available to you.
Yeah. And that's hard because sometimes you don't get to choose that,
Right, exactly.
right? And
Exactly.
so, which only
Yeah.
compounds that sense of I'm not connected to anyone, right? And that's hard. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes it's weird because in some ways there's elements of that are stage of life,
Yeah.
season of life, like
Yep.
where you're at. Like I know, like when we had young kids, we had so very few connections outside of work, or we were starting the church,
Yeah.
or like that immediate circle of
Yep,
people.
yep.
But then, having been here long enough to be with people that have lived a life, maybe their spouse has passed away, and that was their social connection, or
yep.
those connections were with those people,
Yeah.
or that circle of friends there. And then when somebody passes, it's really weird to enter back into that. And so I've watched people in different stages deal with loneliness, and now,
Yeah.
like even in having worked with students, you see students
Yeah.
struggle with that as well.
Yeah, which is new
Yeah.
in a sense that we're seeing. So in the book Bowling Alone, that came out as kind of this quintessential work on he called it social capital.
Okay.
And in the book,
It was like from the 90s.
came out in '95.
Okay.
But it references studies from the '70s up to like '70s, '80s into the '90s.
Okay.
And what the author found in writing and in studying this, said that since the '50s, the social capital has
Yeah.
been declining. Social capital that people have has been declining.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fast forward to just 2 years ago, there was an international study done in 22, and the findings were published in 23,
Yeah.
that found that 1 in 4 people they did 142 countries. They
Wow.
studied 142 countries. 1 in 4 people would say that they're lonely, that they are suffering from loneliness. Not just, I don't have a lot of friends,
Yeah.
but like it's having an emotional impact on them.
Wow.
A quarter of the world.
Yeah.
Think about that.
So if you're in a room with 10 people, 2.5 of them are lonely.
Yeah, and that half person is, man, the poor
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah.
Oh. So yeah, you've got a quarter of the world is suffering from loneliness. When you look at just the U.S.
Yeah.
in that age range, it was 15 to
15 to 24.
25,
Yeah.
or 15 to 24 in that international study.
Yeah.
It was higher. It was 27%.
Okay. Wow.
Instead of the 25.
Yeah.
In the U.S., that 15 to 25 range,
Mm-hmm.
or 15 to 29, in a different study, a Harvard study
Yeah.
that was done, that that's 36%.
Yeah.
So 36% of the 15 to 29-year-olds
Yeah.
would say that they are lonely, that they're
Yeah.
disconnected.
Yeah.
That's new.
Yeah.
Because we have seen in the past, like that bowling alone, it was more in the middle age
Yeah.
range.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing younger and younger people say that they're lonely. And I think that it's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's really sad because I believe that if we extrapolate that out,
Sure.
if you hit your 30s into your 40s and say, yeah, I'm lonely, I don't have the connections, I'm not known like I used
Yeah.
to be. That was at least up until that point.
Yeah.
Now we're seeing 15-year-olds saying, like 36% of the 15-year-olds are saying, I'm lonely.
I'm terribly lonely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you start looking at what are the physiological health consequences
Exactly.
of that, right?
Yep.
And we won't see the long-term results of that, you know, because if the study was done and released in 23,
Yeah.
there's like we're continuing to progress as a society. So where is that going to put us in 15 or 20 years?
And that was a post-pandemic
Yeah.
survey. When during the pandemic, it was much higher because everyone was isolating. But so in that age range, it was like 61%.
Yeah.
Said during the pandemic said they were lonely. So
Yeah.
it dropped after the pandemic,
Yeah.
and everyone got back to life.
Sure.
But it never went back down to those low 20s that it used to be.
Yeah.
It's still up in that 36% range.
Yeah.
So I feel like when you look at culturally, up until you graduate from college, there's built-in connection, right? So
Or at least there's potential social structures
yeah,
that
there's
people are connected
structures,
to.
right?
Yeah.
Right. So you're in school, you have this affinity with people, you're all going through the same thing.
Yeah.
Then you go to college, maybe you have a whole new group of friends, but there are people there, you know, you're in labs or you're in classes, you're doing homework together.
Yeah.
There are these structures that are in place. But then we get out of school.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's really where the damage where we start to see it. The inability to make connection and be known
Yeah.
seems to be, that's where there's no structure
Yeah.
left.
Yeah. It's weird in the sense of you kind of watch that. When we first mentioned that correlation to everything yesterday and like, what are we going to talk about? And realizing, you know, they're very true in life. Like when you're going through high school, you may have a small group of people you interact with, or that you're in a club together, or you're doing something in some social setting or a team or whatever. College, again, you know, but even times our experience, as you've already alluded to in college, it is already a little, you know, disorienting, a little like, oh, I'm becoming an adult. I've got more independence, and you're thrilled about that.
Definitely a transitionary time.
Yeah. And then you end up, you know, out, and, you know, I'm curious about the rise in remote work and some of those things, because at least when you transition out of college, often you may have, you know, coworkers that you have some kind of connection with, right?
Yeah.
And so that kind of becomes that next potential social structure. But that happens usually in one place, in one setting, and those relationships don't always translate to outside of work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then what do you do?
Have you, just to cut in,
Sure.
You reminded me of how I've had conversations with people within a context.
Yeah.
And then you're outside of that context and you don't know what to talk about.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like if you're at work and you're at work and you talk about work all the time.
Yeah.
If you're at like a Christmas party or something, you go to somebody's house.
Yeah.
You just sit and talk about work again.
Yeah.
Or you don't talk about anything.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing because even between our families at a relational level, the effort to stay connected as friends outside of
Right.
church
Right.
and
Yep.
work, it's very, you have to be intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's kind of like, it's like a family that stays together for the sake of the kids. You know, when the kids are gone, what happens,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you're sitting here saying, like, it would be very easy, you know, over the 14, 15 years that we've been friends and then, or been in ministry in the 20 years that we've been friends, you get to that weird spot where it's like, man, we could only ever talk about work.
Right.
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 We could only ever talk
Yeah.
about like things that are going on and what we need to get done.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, you know, I feel like, and there's been seasons where that is the easy thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there's been other
It's
seasons.
the default.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what is that like for everybody else?
Yeah.
You know, that may not have had those friendships before they got to work, right? So we kind of were ahead of the curve in that realm.
Yeah.
But then you've got folks that may, like, with the transient nature of society, people are moving a lot more. They're going to a new community. They may not stay connected to other people. And so
Yeah.
all of a sudden you've got this.
It's a churn.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what do you do? I'm alone. I don't have any
Yep.
connections. How do I make connections?
Yeah. And
right?
I can't get away from this because I think it's so important. It goes back to what you said about being known. When you only have that school connection, the high school connection, the affinity group that you're in, when you only have the work connection,
Yeah.
when those connections are based on the context,
Yeah.
then you're not really known as a person,
Sure.
and you don't know that other person.
Sure.
So you don't know what's happening in their life. They don't know what's happening in your life.
Yeah.
And a work party is not necessarily the place to start saying,
Yeah.
so really, what's going on? You know,
Yeah.
tell me what's happening.
Yeah.
So I think that it's a facade, and it's part of. Well, I don't want it to sound too negative.
Yeah.
It's this facade of relationship. It's a facade of community.
Yeah.
When you have a context when you have something that provides a context for relational connection without actually pushing into a relationship.
Yeah.
It pushes into casual connection,
Sure.
and I think that's why social media, then, to go like reference back to what we talked
Yeah.
about last week.
Yeah.
I think that's why social media tends to be something that pulls people away from connection rather
Sure.
than fosters it, because it's still that facade.
Yeah.
There's still that barrier in there that it's providing a context, but not an actual depth of relationship.
Yeah, it's weird. I think I said that to start things before, but we moved a lot as a kid. Like, so I think I was in 6 or 7 different school districts I was in 7 different school districts by the time I was in the 6th grade. So I was usually the new kid at least once a year.
Yeah.
Sometimes twice. And like looking at that and realizing I didn't know how to really make lasting friendships, or at least the way I protected myself was to not make a lasting friendship. 'Cause I was always going to be the new kid. I
You
was
knew you
leaving.
were going to leave.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And so then to look at how that affected me as an adult and how I approached relationships, I always kept, I would always make quick friends, but keep them at arm's distance
Yeah,
to
yeah.
avoid like really being known. So that begins to, but what I was thinking of is when I remember moving to the last place that my parents still live, right? I was the outsider. And so, but I got to see the community of kids that grew up in the same neighborhood, in the same schools, that spent years together. And now as an adult, I look in communities in our area where people have grown up there, their kids have been raised there, they're on the same sports teams, and you look at it and it's very easy to go, I'm an outsider in this community, right? And so you begin to try to go like the effort to build connections is at times it's really, I don't mean to make it sound horrible, but it's exhausting.
Yeah.
Because you're always trying to think of, okay, in order for me to build some connections here, I have to step outside of what is maybe most comfortable for me. Or after a long day's work, I just want to go home, take my shoes off, and relax. But to build relationships or make inroads into a new community, it's like, well, I got to get up and go do this now, you know, or to try to help our kids establish that type of relationship, we've got to go do that. And so there's this it's very much there's a context for the places we find ourselves, and
Yeah.
and I think the transient nature of our society contributes to it. You know, and I don't want to make like social media like the bag, but
Yeah.
it's an easier thing to do than to go in and connect with folks.
Yeah.
I've just observed affinity tends to be the thing people connect around.
It's the first step.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think that there's a negative to that
no.
necessarily. But there is a level of maturity that's required in order to move past just affinity.
Yeah.
I think when you're in high school, even college,
Yeah.
that's enough.
Yeah.
You know, I really like bowling, so
Yeah.
okay,
Wow.
we've connected on that.
Yeah.
And so
I don't like that teacher.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you do kind of grow up because culture is.
There's a lot of
push it-
firsts in that
Yeah,
season of life, right?
yeah.
Driver's license. There's things that people can relate around.
Yeah, and there's always change.
Yeah.
And you're just used to that. And it's kind of like when you're a little kid and you're like, do you like blue? I like blue.
Yeah.
We're best friends now.
Yeah.
It's kind of like as you get older, you kind of have that same mentality. Like, you like football? I like football. Let's watch football
What
together.
team do you like? Oh, we can't be friends.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, you like the same team. Okay,
Yeah.
now we can be
Yeah,
friends.
yeah.
But I think we can go through our whole lives with that being the surface.
Yeah.
The affinity is always the surface level.
Sure.
It's the thing that
the first
connects
step.
us. It's the first step.
Yeah. And often the thing that continues to
Yeah.
like keep people connected,
Right,
Because there's a
right.
common interest, right, outside of just each other.
Yeah. But I think when you stay there, that's where, as you get older, you realize that
Yeah.
there's nothing more to this relationship than we get together on the weekend and watch
Sure.
football.
Yeah.
We talk about work. And you start to desire. I don't think a more immature person doesn't desire or doesn't even know they need to be known.
Yeah.
You know, at a deeper level. But as you grow, you kind of go, I need somebody else with me in
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
You know, this sucks.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
I need someone else to know what's going on. I've
Yeah.
had, as a pastor, we've had those conversations with people that just say, I just need you to know what's happening. I don't need answers. I don't think you'll have
I
answers.
just want somebody to be aware.
Yeah, you just have to know what's going on in my life.
Yeah.
And most of us don't have those relationships within the affinity groups that we are in
Sure.
that we can say that
And
to.
that's true whether you're a single adult or in a marriage. That's the weirdest thing is you can interact with people in relationships, in committed relationships, or those that are that's just not in my life right now, and so they don't have somebody that lives with them.
Yeah.
Versus somebody that does have somebody to live with them, but they both feel lonely anyway.
Yeah, and that's part of the epidemic is to be in close proximity to each other and still not know each other at an intimate level where you don't feel that loneliness.
Yeah, and I think that's gets to some of the things that we've talked about over the years of to be known requires you to be vulnerable.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's nerve-wracking.
Oh,
You've got to put yourself out there.
It's exhausting.
To try to connect,
really. You
right?
talked about it being exhausting, like trying to get up as an adult and be like, let's go make friends today.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. And like, am I gonna make a friend, or am I gonna be rejected again?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Or are we going to be in a relationship for a couple of years and then I say something that
wrong. Yeah.
offends them or blows the relationship up and they so it's emotionally exhausting to go through that to try to connect with people on a vulnerable level.
Yeah.
And then as an adult, you're tired already.
Yeah.
You have other things
You
going
have
on.
responsibilities.
Yeah. So I think that if we take kind of a broader view,
Yeah.
our culture, American culture, is not designed for relationship.
It's true.
It's not structured for vulnerability or for community, really.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it.
Sure. Even in the church, let's do life together.
Yeah, we talk about that, but
What is that?
what's it really mean?
Yeah.
And I think there's a what's his name? Not Jonathan Haidt. Ryan Burge.
Okay.
He does graphs about religion or something like that.
Okay.
He does, but he's a social scientist.
Okay.
And he studied this, all of the information, these data sets, and was talking about how church has changed.
Yeah.
Like even Pew Research used to say regular church attendance was twice a month. Now it's
Yeah.
like once a month.
Yeah.
And so Ryan Burge looked at this data set, and here are the reasons that people were leaving the church.
Yeah.
The number one reason shocked me. The number one reason that people are leaving the church, they stop attending church, is busyness.
Mm-hmm.
It has nothing to do with the structure of the church. Well, I can't say it has nothing to do with it, but
Yeah.
When you look at all of the
Got
reasons,
too much going on.
it's basically too much happening in your life. You have work, you have kids sports, you have other
Where you've got professional endeavors.
you have other
Yeah.
hobbies, like other
interests. Yeah.
So and the number one way that people stop going to church is or the circumstances is they move, and they moved to a new location,
Yeah.
and they just can't put the time into finding a new church, finding a whole new community.
Yeah.
So the church the church attendance in America is dwindling like exponentially.
Yeah.
And the number one reason is we're too busy.
Yeah.
So
That's interesting.
our structure of society is to keep us busy. It's to how much of our value and our worth are in what we produce.
Sure. How are you doing? Well, how are things going? I'm busy.
Yeah, I'm busy. I'm tired.
Yeah.
Like everybody says that. So I started thinking
Non-answer.
about that, how busyness is a community killer.
Yeah.
Like that you won't find community, you won't find friendship, you won't get out of the loneliness
Yeah.
if you're always busy.
Yeah.
Because it takes the energy to be
Yeah.
vulnerable. It takes energy and time to say, hey, let's get coffee together.
Yeah.
Let's get lunch together. So I think that when we look at the structure of our society, we have to recognize that it's not set up for us to make friends.
Yeah.
It's not set up for us to be drawn to community. It's the structure of our society is set up to be good producers and buyers,
Yeah.
or consumers,
Consumers,
producers and
yeah.
consumers.
Yeah. That's so this reminds me of some of the things, even just for your own mental health and well-being, that I walked through coming out of like that burnout and depression season. Was I had to slow down.
Yeah.
I had to be more than just what I could produce and contribute. I had to learn to identify what the priorities were and rearrange life around those.
Yeah.
And that's scary. So if you're dealing with loneliness or a lack of relationships, like not just like casual friendships or interactions, acquaintances, but like real people that know you and that you know and that you care about each other, you check it. Like if you're outside of those types of things, it's like, or you want that, do we really want it enough to alter our schedules to create space for it?
Yeah.
And if we do, are we finding a community of other people that are willing to open their schedules
That's also the challenge.
for you, right? And so I think that gets back into the what does it look like to build a community of belonging that we talked about, just here at the Grove is it's not just you being friendly.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just on you. It's on all of us to make space for people because relationships matter.
Yeah.
Right? And it's almost I think about just even the way that our family is organized and some of the ways that we responded to the ways we were raised as like my wife and I. She grew up as a pastor's daughter. And so they lived in the parsonage, and so their house wasn't their house, and so everybody always stopped in. And so for her, that was like, we can't have a private space.
Yeah.
I grew up you know, not my parents weren't in ministry. My dad was gone all the time. We had an open door policy. It, literally to this day, anyone will just walk into my parents' house. It's very much like sitcom from the 80s. It's like Kramer in Seinfeld. Like people just walk in the door. So, and you're like, you
have an
might be in the
applause track when
bathroom,
somebody
you know,
walks in.
doors open, you hear the door open and somebody's other voice, you're like, just wait there. We'll be like, that's the way it is. But so I grew up open door.
Yeah.
Anybody comes in, any given moment. Amy grew up where that was like one of those things that like that.
It was the same thing, but it was
But a
negative
different
for
motivation,
her,
right?
it
And
was
so
positive for
trying to
you.
navigate that
Yeah.
for us, like, and it really does come down to, I think, as we're talking about this and I'm thinking through this, it's like, what's hospitality in our culture,
Yeah, yeah,
right? It's not entertaining people. It's inviting people into your life where it is, how it is.
yeah, yeah.
And, man, I feel like I need to think on that a little more.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
because you can sit there and say, oh, we want to have people over or we want to connect. You know, we want it,
Yeah.
but how do we really want it?
Yeah.
And that's the thing
Yeah.
where like we have plenty of relationships with people, but it's at convenient, like it's always at a
It's
convenience.
formal.
It's formalized as opposed to just, hey, give you somebody a text, hey, I'm swinging through the neighborhood. Are you going to be home
Yeah.
in 5 minutes so I can stop by for a couple minutes? You
Yep,
know,
yep.
it's the unexpected interruptions where a lot of relationships happen.
Yeah.
And I think about a previous generation, or at least in some contexts, where that was just the way of life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, just for my family personally, I don't think my parents would say that they struggle with loneliness. There's other things they may struggle with.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's always people like just coming in. There's always people that know that that's a safe place and they show up.
Yeah.
And so they're there because they want the connection. And my parents are hospitable like that.
Yeah.
I've seen that in the way that you and Jasmine operate your home with like the kids and their friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're always ready to be hospitable, you know?
But it is different because they're like 18 to 20.
Yeah.
And we just had them this weekend. We had eight kids, eight in our house for 3 days.
Yeah.
Like they came over Friday and they left Sunday night.
Yeah.
They kind of like filtered out, but we had kids in our house until Sunday night at midnight.
Yeah. That weren't your own.
That weren't our own. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is like, that is something that we've taken seriously, and it made intentional steps to say, you're always welcome. This is a safe place.
Sure.
Doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, what you've come from. This is the safe place for you to hang out. And so we've done that, and they've taken us up on it.
Yeah.
It is very different to do that with like a 40-year-old man, you know, or a couple.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, Mike, I'm in my 40s.
Well, I mean,
you don't invite me over for 3 days.
The response, that's my point. The response is different. Like a 19-year-old who's, they go to a local college and they're just like, stop by. Like we have 2 kids coming by tonight at 8.
Yeah.
They stay for 2 hours.
Yeah.
They had night classes. They'll hang out for a couple of hours and then leave.
Yeah.
And we hang out with them. We don't just like welcome them in and then
try.
leave. We try. We hang out with them and
Yeah.
we talk, have good conversations. And I would think of single guys.
Yeah.
There were 2 back when my wife and I were married.
Yeah.
First couple of years before we had kids, these 2 guys would just stop by.
Yeah.
Anytime.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'd call. Sometimes they just knock.
Yeah.
One time we were going out to dinner and he's like, that's okay, I'll just hang out. So we're like, okay, cool. So he just hung out at our house until we came back.
Yeah.
But that changes as you get older.
Yeah.
Like there's not it's just the feeling of, oh, a couple, like friends are coming over.
Yeah.
Well, we need to clean the house. We need to make sure everything's good.
Yeah.
We need to have a meal plan. We need to, like,
Yeah.
there's a sense of formality to that, that when you have some 18, 19, 20-year-old
So
people
funny.
coming over.
Yeah.
They just come over. We make sure
Yeah.
that the bathroom's clean and everything else to
Yeah.
just do whatever.
Yeah.
So I think the expectations that we have for
Yeah.
ourselves
Sure.
doesn't allow for that open door policy
It affects
sometimes.
the ability for us to be hospitable.
Right.
Which
Because
hospitality opens the door for relationships. It doesn't build them,
Yeah.
but it opens the door for
Yep.
them. And there's
Yep.
vulnerability on both sides.
Yeah.
Right? It's
Yeah.
it's as you described that, when I first moved to the area, I lived with a widow lady and her dad. Both
Mm-hmm.
were older. But I observed hospitality the way Dory lived.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very fascinating thing. But it was so funny because she always had like a canned ham or something else that was
Yeah,
on
yeah.
like, and if somebody showed up around dinner,
Mm-hmm.
she always would be like,
make dinner.
like she was just like, you know what? If you guys don't have plans, I can make dinner for us all, and we can just visit still.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like there was like that front porch
Yeah.
hospitality of
Yep.
just people talking,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And I think that was one of the things that I remember about growing up in the South
Mm.
was my parents lived with a front porch
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah.
invitation for folks.
Yeah.
And so people would stop off and spend time there. But it was a slower pace of life.
Yep.
And I think about that now and go, that's different.
Yeah.
And what does my discipleship to Jesus look like
Yep.
in
Yeah.
hospitality? Like how Jesus made time for people, how
Yeah.
people were always like, people seemed to interrupt him wherever it was that he was
Yep.
going.
Yep.
And there were times where he continued to move, but there were a lot of times, more times, where he would slow down and interact with them as an individual.
Yeah.
And how should that affect the way that as a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
I live my life
Mm-hmm.
towards other people?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean I have to be friends with everybody,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't,
Yeah.
but it does mean that there are people that are in my life that we make an intentional effort to be open to
Mm-hmm.
and for.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it seems like we've orbited maybe somewhat away from the loneliness, but we've kind of, we've just broadened the orbit around the topic.
Yeah, I think that it's important to recognize the conditions that lead
Sure.
to loneliness.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at. Like these are the conditions of American society.
Yeah.
We tend to be so busy, we don't have time to put the effort in. There's expectations that we have for ourselves or that we feel like culturally
Yeah.
others have for us that we can't be just
Yeah.
hospitable
Yeah.
an informal
Yeah.
way. And we tend to grow up with this facade of,
Yeah.
oh, we're around people all the time, so we're fine.
Yeah, or we don't want to be one I hear is, oh, I just didn't want to bother you guys because I know you're so busy.
Yeah, yeah.
But meanwhile, that person's dying inside.
Right.
You know, they don't want to inconvenience somebody, right? Because we wait until something goes wrong to go see the doctor. We wait
Or the
until
pastor.
or the pastor, or yeah, that's true, right?
Yeah.
Or we just get to a spot where we're so desperately hungry for relationships, we look for a connection in unhealthy ways.
Yeah.
And then we end up dealing with additional consequences to our loneliness, right?
Yeah.
Rather than finding places to connect with people, and maybe that's why there's an increase in being too busy. Maybe those hobbies are places where people do feel connection.
Yeah, because you don't want to be alone.
Yeah.
And you don't want to not be busy.
Yeah.
You have to sit quietly by yourself. That's terrible.
Sounds
That's
fantastic.
Yeah. No.
Who are you talking about, Mike? I know you well
I
enough
would
to know.
absolutely love to do that.
So, but I think at a practical level, like, what are the things that we would suggest to people that are dealing with loneliness and those that just aren't, right? So, and most of our audience are people that I would say are Christians or exploring that or wrestling with some of those teachings,
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah.
so let's think of it from a mindset of not necessarily like broad sociological,
Right. Just
but what does it look like as a Christian to?
the first thing I think, and this is broad. This isn't necessarily
We'll funnel
faith-based.
down.
Yeah. The first thing that I think we have to look at is, do we make space in our lives for relationships?
Yes.
Or is every moment accounted for to the point where we're just too tired?
Yeah.
Like, I say that
That's real, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
real. Like as an introvert, I have that problem. Social interaction tires me out.
Yeah.
I loved having the kids around through the weekend,
Yeah.
but I tell you what, by Sunday night, I was so tapped out
Yeah.
relationally.
Yeah. That's why we didn't talk much yesterday.
Yeah, yeah. Also,
But even my talking still was exhausting.
it's that's the thing that people need to understand about
Yeah.
being introverted. It has nothing to do with the person. It's
Yeah.
just it's like a fuel tank.
Yeah.
You know, you might be going to a really good place,
Yeah.
but you're still going to run out of gas.
Yeah. Yeah.
and so, but I think extroverts have that too.
Absolutely.
So there's just there you have to examine your life.
Yeah.
Are you so worn out that you can't actually go into a relational context with anyone?
Yeah.
Are you running so much, so hard that right close to that line that by the time you get away from your schedule, your busyness,
Sure.
you need a recovery time?
Yeah.
So I think that's, to me, that's like,
So is there
first.
space, right?
Yeah, is there space for any relationships? And it's
Yeah.
not just the relationships that you might have, but if you find yourself in a place of real deep loneliness and needing that connection, do you have space in your life for that?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't just happen.
No,
It
it doesn't.
It takes effort and
Friends
intention.
generally don't fall in your lap.
Yeah,
Right? Like
yeah.
I stinking had to adopt you. Like I'm like, oh, you're gonna be my friend whether you like it or not.
I was like, I already have one.
I have a friend, and she's been my wife
And
for a
she-
long
and
time.
I married her.
Yeah. So, but I think there's a vulnerability part too.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have the space for it, if you don't have the space, make it.
Yeah.
If you do have the space, maybe it's putting the word out before you're in crisis.
Yeah.
Like if you're someone who is hungry for relationships that move beyond surface
Yeah.
levels, right?
Yep.
Don't give up and
Yeah.
keep making yourself like vulnerable. Look for people that do have space in their time.
And that doesn't mean like trauma dumping on your first time to
No,
hang out with
there's
somebody.
boundaries in friendships,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, but the vulnerability means asking the question.
Yeah. Hey, do you have some time to grab coffee?
Yeah, and asking about that person.
Yeah.
I like to have a few questions in
Yeah.
my back pocket that I'm just like, I'm going to
Yeah.
ask these questions.
Yeah.
And they'll ask me those questions. Like,
Yeah.
oh, so what's your journey been
Yeah,
like? What's
yeah.
gotten you to this place here?
Yeah. Are we so focused on being interesting that we can't be interested in someone?
Being
right?
curious about
Yeah.
other people.
Yeah.
Having that curiosity
Yeah.
is really critical
Yeah.
because that opens them up
Yeah.
too. And it's not prying, but it's just being curious.
Yeah.
And having the reciprocation of that curiosity.
Yeah, I've had to work very because at times, especially when I was younger, I would fill silence with I felt like, oh, there's got to be communication,
Yeah.
right? So learning to be at a spot where I was comfortable somewhat with silence and learning to just ask better questions and to listen that was a big part of it, because sometimes when we get anxious that, oh, I want them to like me, we'll try to make ourselves look a little more like interesting to that person, right?
Yeah.
Rather than people have fascinating stories, even if they don't think they do. And so like that vulnerability of, hey, could we grab coffee sometime?
Yep.
It's not just going in and like, blah,
Right,
here's
right.
everything where I'm at.
Yeah.
But it's like, give it time, be patient in the process, so if it's a, do we have the capacity or the space? If not,
Then make it.
then make
Then you
it,
have to
right?
make it.
If we want relationships, we
Yep.
should prioritize relationships.
Yeah.
Be willing to seek relationships, look for opportunities to be connected.
Yeah, learn how to ask questions, to be curious, to lead the conversation into places that
Yeah.
may require some vulnerability, not too
Yeah.
much that you freak yourself
Yeah.
out or somebody else. I think another thing that we tend to maybe not recognize is we can be too desperate for relationships.
Okay.
And so when you have the opportunity to meet somebody, it's kind of like, this could be my next best friend.
Yeah.
And if, as a person who's been lonely
Yeah.
and wanted that,
Yeah.
I had to not be that person that
Sure.
just assumes that this one I'm talking to is the next best
Yeah,
friend.
just because you have a connection doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean that that connection will become lifelong
Yep.
or deep soul connections.
Right. My wife, Jasmine, always, she would say to me, not everyone is your friend. You know, just because you had coffee with them
Yeah.
doesn't mean they're your new friend or something. I'm like,
She
what?
was just jealous.
What do you mean?
She was just jealous
I'm like,
of-
you
of
moved
us
13,
grabbing-
you moved 13 times in your life. You
Yeah.
don't know that.
Yeah, that's true, right?
But we can place, I think we can place too much weight on it.
Yeah.
Especially if
We're on
for-
ourselves, right?
if
like,
it's-
oh, don't screw up.
yeah. And if we're single,
Yeah.
you know, it's the potential of a relationship or
Or just a connection.
Yeah.
Because not everybody's looking for a romantic relationship.
well, that's what I mean.
Maybe that's the clarifying point.
We can put too much weight on it as this could go somewhere.
Sure, especially if it's some
Opposites.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's. I think that we have to kind of move away from where is this going to go,
Sure.
no matter what it is.
Yeah.
Like the assumption this is going to go somewhere deep
Sure.
and good, and I'm putting all of my hope in this.
Yeah.
Just relax.
Yeah.
Enjoy each other.
Yeah.
Enjoy being in the company of another person.
Yeah.
When you can rest in that,
Yeah.
that makes so much difference for the other person to
Sure.
just be like, oh, this is
Yeah.
so comfortable.
Yeah.
This is a safe person. I can let my guard down a little
Yeah.
bit, and the friendship grows from there.
Yeah, I think the one thing getting into, and we've already addressed it a little bit, is what does that look like from a faith perspective?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I would lean into how did we see Jesus live, where he made time for people,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
and what does that look like to be hospitable like Jesus was to us? What does that look like to be hospitable? Like Jesus didn't have a house.
Yeah.
So how was he hospitable?
Yeah.
So, well, he told Zacchaeus, "Hey, I'd like to come have lunch with you today. You know, let's
Yeah.
go." Right? Like he
Yeah.
made opportunities to spend time with someone, and there was, you know, he had the benefit of, you know, understanding everything underneath the surface that wasn't seen, right? But there was an intentional slowing down
Yep.
and connecting with people.
Yep.
And so sometimes I think when I look at the church and the way that the church met the needs of other people within the community, there had to be an awareness of it,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And so I think from a faith perspective, the thing that you mentioned, and it's broad as well, there is a way that we respond in worship by being connected to people. There is a way that we image God
Yeah.
by making time to
Yep.
be a part of a community. And I think
Yes.
that's where at its best, the church can be that. It can be a place where we pursue God and our faith together,
Yeah.
but also understanding that God made us to exist in community.
Yep. Yep.
And I've seen that happen as people in the church have affinity, have stage of life or seasons where there is a connection and it's an encouragement
Yeah.
to them in that place.
Yeah.
But also, like, looking at the way Paul wrote, I believe it was in Corinth, that the things that we have been through in our life become opportunities for us to encourage other
We've been
people.
comforted.
Yeah,
We can
comfort
comfort
others with the
others
things
with the
that
same
they've been-
comfort that we've been given.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's all of those things that I see in Scripture that point to relational connection and hospitality that cares about other people.
Yeah.
And that crosses. That I think really depends on, it's up to us to create that. If we see it, and part of being obedient to Jesus,
Yeah.
in our discipleship to Jesus, in growing in that, there's ways that we build community of belonging with people that are similar to us, that are different to us, and provide relational connection.
Yeah.
I think that's got to, like, we've got to look at relationships as a part of our faith.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that if you are part of a faith community, then that is part of what you should be doing in that community.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean going and befriending 100 people.
Yeah.
But if you find yourself lonely in a faith community, then be a person that steps into that space of saying, okay, let's get together.
Yeah. And that may start around affinities.
It almost always will.
Yeah.
But being cognizant enough of the relationship to start asking questions outside of that affinity.
Yeah.
To start asking about life.
Yeah.
To start thinking about who is this person
Sure.
aside from the context
Yeah.
that I know them in.
Yeah.
And I think to me it should be easier in a
Yeah.
faith community, but my experience is it's harder.
It's often harder.
It's
because
often
maybe
harder.
that's because sometimes we're afraid to actually let ourselves be known.
Right.
Right.
It goes
It's
goes
easier.
back to that.
It's easier. Like, so when
I'll be judged.
Sure.
People will think that I'm not a good Christian or something like that.
When I worked in an educational environment, outside of a faith context, I remember the connections of people that would happen. Like, okay, there's work connections, but everybody would go to the bar afterwards and relax, and just kind of like whatever. And so I'd occasionally go down and hang out with them, and I watched the relationships there that like progress. And I was like, oh, like they weren't afraid to say what they thought.
Yep.
But I've watched people in church go, can we say this around the pastor?
Yeah.
Can we, like,
or around each other.
or-
Do
yeah.
I know that person
right?
well
And so
enough
there's
to be able to
fear
say
of,
that?
am I going to be rejected?
Yep.
And I think the church has to move beyond
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
to be able to be a place of belonging that accepts people where they're at
Mm-hmm.
as people in progress, as people in transformation.
Yeah.
And is able to still be friends.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's a real important thing.
Yeah.
Man, I don't know if you got other things to add to it. But
No, I think that's a good place
Yeah.
to pull it to a close.
Yeah.
I think this is a really important topic, though,
Mm.
that all the way from saying, look, we're recognizing scientifically that
Yeah.
there are physical repercussions
Yeah.
for being lonely
Yeah.
and living in a state of loneliness, to the spiritual repercussions of not being known, not having a community that you can share struggle with, not having a community or any other people that you can walk through life with and know that they know what's going on, that they have that they're there for your support. It just across the board, I think it's really, it's doing damage to us as humans.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's a church related thing,
Yeah.
there's damage being done. And I think that we need to take it seriously enough that as individuals, we start to say,
Yeah.
how can I be somebody that helps another person's
Yeah.
loneliness?
Right. That's love.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Ultimately,
Ultimately,
Yeah.
it's love.
Yeah.
It's seeing God's love and loving people, right? Okay. Love
Yeah.
God, love your neighbor.
Yep.
So
That's what we're called to do.
Yeah.
And I think we would have a lot less of a loneliness epidemic if we loved God and loved our neighbor.
yeah, that's good stuff. That's good stuff.
Well, thanks a lot for joining us, being part of our thinking out loud on these things. If you have questions, if you are looking for a faith community that you're, something struck a chord in our conversation today where you felt like, man, I really need that connection. I need that place in my life. Let us know. If you're local, then you're welcome at the Grove Church anytime. If you have questions or comments or are looking for a church somewhere else, we'll do what we can to help.
Yeah.
You can contact us at discoverthegrove.com, fill out a contact form there, and communicate with us that way. Leave a comment in the YouTube video. Those are just a couple of different ways that we can communicate. But thanks again for being with us this week. It's always good to be with you, Scott.
Aw,
I'm
shucks.
thankful that I'm not lonely when I'm with you.
Oh, that sounds like a song.
Maybe it will be.
Probably already is.
It is.
Yeah.
Have a good week, everyone.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye.